Well, welcome everyone to this episode of Asia Inside Out. I'm here with Dr. David Zweig, who is just coming out with a book on a topic that I know this audience will be quite interested in. It is about the war for global talent, but particularly about the talent competition between the US and China. How China has fostered its search for bringing talent, Chinese talent, back into the country, and how US views of that have changed over time. So welcome, Dr. Zweig. We're happy to have you.
Can I jump in on that? Which is, I would just add, it's not just the talent, but it's also the technology. And I think it's the technology that becomes the real danger from the United States perspective, right? It's the talent bringing back or facilitating the transfer of technology. That's why the book's called The War for Chinese Talent and Technology between the United States and China. And that's where the Americans get very nervous.
Right. So not just the people, but the scientific collaboration, the opportunities for tech transfer, and with all of that, the economic and military competitiveness that could follow from that tech transfer.
Sure. Well, it's China's, on the one hand, getting people to come back, there's two aspects to this strategy. One is to get people to come back, what's called reverse migration. And if the people go back full time, the United States really can't complain, because those people are doing research in China, they're getting money from China, they're using labs in China, but they're not sitting in the United States getting American money, doing research in American universities and American labs, and then taking the product of that research and transferring that back to China. That's where the hostility and the difficulty really arises. And that's why the people who have stayed, the mainland, the China-born scholars who have stayed in the United States, were the target of the China Initiative.
And we are going to get into all of those subjects throughout this discussion, but I want to start with just the policies that China has adopted in order to facilitate this transfer of talent, technology, and the opportunities for joint research that it sees as allowing itself to move up the economic value chain. So tell us a little bit about that. How has China fostered its vision of what this looks like and means for its own interest over time?
Sure. Well, Deng Xiaoping back in 1978 said we have to learn from the West. We have to learn from the advantaged, from the advanced countries, and we should send students out. And so that really begins back in 1978. And he only thought that China would lose about 10% of the students, and he was wrong. China loses 90% of the talent, right? 90% of the PhDs that come, Chinese who come to the United States and get a PhD don't go back. Now it's down to 80%, but for a long time it was 90%. So that really became a shock.
About what time do you think that started to change? Was it relatively recent?
Relatively recently. It sat around 90% for a long time.
I see.
And it's gone down, and part of it goes down partly because of the China Initiative, which we can talk about later.
Sure.
But so still 80% of them not going back.
Right.
And in AI, there's estimates that 90% don't go back.
Right.
Only 10% go back in topics related to AI. So China started to get really nervous about this, the fact that people weren't coming back. And so really around 1996, they started a series of policies to try and encourage people to come and visit and see what China was like, and then hopefully they would be willing to share what they knew. And in 2000, Jiang Zemin comes out with a policy, 2001, comes out with a policy called Serving the Nation, 为国服务, right, without returning. 惠国服务, right? So you can serve the country without coming back, and lays out a whole series of ways that people can do it, collaborative research, part-time teaching, professional associations being mobilized to transfer whatever good they have as a group, whether it's technology, knowledge, whatever skills, transferring that back, setting up companies, first setting up companies in China, and then later on it becomes setting up Chinese companies in America. That's a later phenomenon. But he lays out 7 ways, and from that time on, it starts to pick up.
Right.
Then in 1993, the Communist Party decides that they are responsible for talent. They take the total control away from the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Personnel, and they take control. But that doesn't change much until the 1,000 Talents Plan.
I see.
Until Li Yuanchao takes over as the head of the organization department and introduces the 1,000 Talents Plan.
Right.
And so that's 2008, 2009.
Right.
And that's got huge incentives.
Right, and the organization department is the department inside the CCP that is primarily concerned with personnel.
Correct.
And talent.
Correct.
But not necessarily outside of the government. So how do you think that?
Well, no, it's now outside of the government. That's what happened in 2003.
I see.
Under Hu Jintao, they took it away. They took all. It's the party manages talent. That's
Period.
what happened. Period. As of 2003.
And it also sounds like there was a bit of a shift in focus and priority as the realization came that, perhaps no matter how many times you asked someone to come back and visit their homeland, it didn't mean that they wanted to move back.
Correct.
So the Chinese government adapted.
Correct.
And said, what can we still kind of benefit from this network of diaspora researchers while they are perhaps never going to return full time to mainland China.
Right. In some ways, they're forced to do that.
Sure.
So Li Yuanchao, who the head of the organization department, thought that if he used the party, he could bring people back. That's what he said. I got the party. I can make this happen. And then lo and behold, he could only get 20% to come back, 25%.
Right.
And so they introduced a part-time program for the 1,000 Talents Plan. Those who came back got huge stuff, huge gifts, incentives, awards, prestige, and all that. But they still had a program which was to encourage people who were staying abroad to help. And that's the Diaspora Option. That's what the Diaspora Option is. And the majority of people took that strategy. So there are approximately, at one point it was estimated that there were over 3,000 China-born professors who had joined the 1,000 Talents Plan part-time, living in the United States.
And at that time,
that's a big number, 3,000.
It is,
anyway.
yeah. It's a large number, 3,000, compared to the totality of the community of researchers of mainland descent in the United States. And particularly, I think, though it was a 1,000 Talents program, what's your estimation on how many people it actually recruited?
8,000.
8,000, so a significant number of the...
The book has details on that.
Of course, and I encourage everyone to read the book for the details.
Right.
But a significant number of the 8,000 people recruited under this program were researchers in the U.S.
Right. So, 3,000 out of 8, so 3/8 were and then some of those people were also in Europe.
Okay.
Right, in Canada, and then the rest went back.
Okay, mostly industrialized countries.
Correct.
Okay. And 2008, 2011, we were in a very different place in U.S.-China relations. I think particularly at the end of 2008, the U.S. was really counting on China to be a partner in resolving macroeconomic instability, right? And it was still, we're in the pre-Xi Jinping era. The U.S. was feeling, I think relatively excited about China's rise and the opportunities that it presented for U.S.-China collaboration in the global economy. So
if I can go right to that, which is just to add the point, Operation Moonshot, which was 2010, which was Obama's plan to beat cancer. In 2010, China and the United States signed an agreement. And they both put in a significant, several $1 million on both sides for the purpose of curing cancer. And then it was renewed in 2015. So yes, very different time. Go ahead.
Very different time. So what was the U.S. government's kind of view toward the 1,000 Talents Plan in this era?
In the early days, let's say up until 2015, it was okay. I think they weren't that worried about it. But I think once Xi comes in, right, then it starts to become less transparent.
Right. So tell us, how did things change? How did these policies and practices of attracting talent and engaging talent overseas, how did that change under Xi Jinping?
Well, the one thing that Xi Jinping, so right away he comes in 2012, 2013, he's saying, we have to find ways for people overseas. We have to create a doorway. for a channel for people overseas to help. But that's nothing new, really. What is new is in 2015, he mobilizes another organization within the Communist Party called the United Front Work Department. And he says that the overseas scholars, or the overseas scholars basically, should be the focal point. He uses the word focal point of United Front work. Now, what does that mean specifically? I don't know, but what does it generally mean? It means that members of the Communist Party, the United Front Work Department, who should be going overseas and contacting these people and working with them to make those transfers happen, right? 2015 is also the year when you get Made in China 2025, which is Xi's strategy to upgrade the technology in China so that if you have a production chain, right, China gets 70% of the value added of the production of that good rather than the 20% that they used to get when it was largely labor, and that was seen as a terrible thing from the United States perspective. So in 2018 is really when this whole thing starts to pick up in the American side. And in 2018, Lighthizer lists in his Section 300 attack on China's trade behavior, he mentions Made in China 2025 maybe 100 times in the document. So it's very much on the American agenda that this is a problem. And the kind of technology that China is reaching out to get is that technology that can help China in that. And therefore, the quality of the technology, I believe, increases dramatically. And the challenges to American business and economics, and also to German, to European, to their economic development or economic security, increase dramatically. It's also at that time that the United States declares China, the Department of Defense comes out with its new strategic plan calls China a strategic competitor that wants to push the United States out of East Asia and basically take over the world. So you get 2018, almost March, April of 2018, all this stuff comes together. And in many ways, it's a response to Xi's greater activism. I think, on this. And as I said, it becomes more secretive, right? We don't know how secretive it becomes, but, some of the government organizations have claimed that they've seen contracts where Chinese scholars in the United States will sign agreements to transfer technology without telling their home unit in the United States. Don't know the extent of that. It may not be very widespread. It could be that the U.S. government agencies are blowing this up to a certain extent. But there are examples, though I've asked to see them and I've never seen them. That's part of the process that makes people more concerned about it. I would add that in 2015 is also the first year that the FBI puts out a notice criticizing the 1,000 Talents Plan. And it was on their website. I saw it. Someone sent it to me. And it was basically to warn scientists in the United States about this program and to watch out for the 1,000 Talents Plan. So really the United States starts as early as 2015 and then really picks up pace in 2018.
So it sounds like there's a confluence of events. First, there's the, Xi Jinping's prioritization of areas of high technology that the U.S. finds or Europeans find are their competitive advantage. And therefore, there's kind of a threat to long-term economic competitive advantage. There's obviously, I think at the same time, there is an increasing opaqueness in Chinese governance, right, which is a hallmark of the Xi Jinping era, where America is not as sure anymore how the different parts of the Chinese government are compartmentalized or siloed. And so you get concerns as well in this era about civil-military fusion, other places where a technology that might be developed for one purpose could be used in military applications.
Dual-use technology.
And at the same time, you have the breakdown in bilateral engagement, part of which was the change of administrations between Obama and Trump.
Sure.
But part of it also, I think, was a fatigue about engagement that whether it was warranted or not, there's certainly a prevailing sense in Washington that through that bilateral engagement, Beijing was getting the better deal, or that the U.S. was not finding the productivity that it needed to invest this time in. So bilateral channels of engagement go from, I think, like 190 to 4.
Could be.
In that same 2016 to 18 era.
It's also in 2018, that's when the U.S. the trade war starts.
Right.
So that's also in March.
Right.
So 2018 really becomes
the organizing year where all of these irritants come together.
Right, and by November of 2018, that's when the China Initiative is declared.
Okay, let's skip to the China Initiative because it's important to understanding the through line of this story. So tell us in your words, what is the FBI's China Initiative? And we've talked a little bit about what drove its creation, but tell us a little bit about how it came to be.
Well, I think in some ways I've sort of said, so there was a kind of momentum, right? And right through 2018, the momentum builds up. In April, I think it's April, the director of FBI, Wray, goes to Congress and speaks to the Senate Intelligence Committee and says that there are Chinese all over the United States. He calls it a all of society strategy to get our technology.
This is a Chinese all of society strategy.
Correct. So basically he's saying that they're all spies, right? And that's a pretty frightening thing if you're a Chinese scholar who's been in the United States for 20 years and all of a sudden the head of the FBI is saying you're a potential spy. In the summer in August of 2018, Trump tells business leaders that all of the Chinese students are spies. Or potential spies, probably says all of the Chinese students are potential spies. And so there's momentum, right? We talked about the March momentum, and then by October, November, Sessions, the head of the DOJ, declares the China Initiative. And in that, the target is really technology theft, intellectual property theft. That's the key target. And included in that, there's about 3 or 4 steps. Included in that is a strategy to teach the administrators of American universities how to discover people who are acting illegally. So it's kind of McCarthyite. Right? They're just sort of mobilizing the universities to look for spies from within.
Right, and everyone is under suspicion.
Correct.
I think that is a key factor here is that the burden is not on actual suspicious behavior, but on your ethnicity as the point of suspicion. Right.
The FBI went to Houston and met with 100 medical schools and warned them that there were people within their schools who were spying for China.
But gave them no actionable information about who those people might be.
No, and in fact, what in the end is, as we'll get to, is that there was very little real intellectual property theft, right? Almost no cases. Someone looked at 50 cases of the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and found that none of the charges were about theft. They were all about not reporting contacts with China.
I see.
And so the China Initiative actually never catches anybody for serious theft of property. Anyway, yep. Jumping ahead.
So we've talked a little bit about, kind of what the U.S. government's approach was to managing this challenge that they see from China and recruiting U.S.-based, but perhaps Chinese ethnicity researchers. Let's talk a little bit about those researchers themselves.
Before we do that,
sure.
Can I just mention that NIH, the National Institute of Health, plays a major role in this as well, because they're the ones who have been giving out grants to these ethnic Chinese professors for research and for collaborative research. And they discover in again, March of 2018, the FBI gives NIH the names of 3,000 Chinese professors who could be suspect of engaging with illegal tech transfer back to China. And the NIH then investigates these people. And what they find is that there are maybe in the end about 350 people who were guilty in some ways and maybe guilty of applying for a grant to NIH without telling NIH that they were getting money from China, what we call the double dippers. Right. Or there were people who had a job in both countries and didn't report that on their grant applications. And the NIH basically declared war on those people. And the person who ran that program declared that they wanted to clear the NIH ecosystem of words, these are quotes, clear the NIH ecosystem of these people related to the Thousand Talents Plan. And in the end, 103 of them were fired.
103 were fired out of the initial, perhaps about 3,000 that were identified as potentially suspicious. Yeah. And no actual kind of major cases of tech transfer were discovered, but it was the opaqueness with which people were engaging with China that drove enough suspicion to cause 100 or so of them to lose their job.
Right. Some people did do things that clearly unethical. If you're a Chinese scholar and you're ranked pretty high and they send you a grant application to evaluate it for the NIH, and then there are one or two cases where they know that the people took that grant application and sent it back to China and said, here's the cutting edge, here's the new stuff, don't tell anybody.
I mean, that is actually intellectual property theft of a sort.
It is, absolutely.
It's not tech transfer, but it is intellectual property
Yes, so
theft.
they did catch people doing that.
Right. And of course, that would be an issue of major concern for NIH and the government.
Right, and in the end, the NIH banned hundreds of Chinese from doing any peer review.
So even the peer review process was subject to the same amount of suspicion as the grant application process. Let's talk about these researchers a little bit because they're people, right? And I think that is important to surface. What do you think from your research, what motivates people to participate in these types of talent schemes? I mean, we can think of several reasons why there might have self-interest, but do you think there are larger principles involved here?
Well, let's start with the self-interest. Sure. Or maybe we should start with the bigger principles. The bigger principles are things like, quotes from friends of mine who said, look, I was able to go overseas and study and learn a lot. And I have this would be earlier, this is in the early 2000s, and many of my friends weren't able to go overseas. So I really need to help them.
Right.
Or I want to train a new generation of Chinese PhDs so that our next generation of scholars will be better. The Cultural Revolution really cut the development of Chinese academia and science and PhDs. There were none. No one was getting a PhD in China in 1978. Right. So there's this need to catch up in terms of that. So, and a lot of people who have been interviewed have said, my country sent me overseas, or I was trained back in China in a medical school, and I really feel some obligation to share with the people, my friends back there, or to help the school develop.
It's a sense of patriotism.
Yeah, I think it's a sense of patriotism. And there's Chinese feel ethnically connected.
Sure.
Right? Diasporas all around the world are like that.
Yes.
Right?
It's not unique to China.
It's not unique to China. I mean, Jews do it, Turks do it, all over the world. The program, the Diaspora Option, began with Colombia. In South America, right? Egyptians do it, right? Everybody does it. But China does it in a much more organized way because it's China, right? They're also, in terms of research capabilities, right? You're a researcher in Australia and you can't get a lot of money for your research in Australia, but China's offering grants.
Right.
And you may be able to connect with someone in China who has access to a significant amount of money. So you're going to do that. Or they have access to new equipment, right, that you may not be able to get in Australia. So you reach out to these people and you set up these collaborative projects and you get the research done.
Right.
Right. So I think so from scientific perspective, that can also be important. Then there's the prestige issue. To be 1,000 talents. I always remember that I was once sitting in a room, because I used to be able to go around and meet 1,000 talents people. I was pretty much connected into the sort of talent system in China for the years some of the years I lived in Hong Kong. And I remember going around with a guy from Xerox or 3M, guy from 3M who had left 3M, who had moved to China, set up his own company. He'd been in China for 15 years. He was given an entrepreneurial 1,000 talents. About 15% of the people, 1,000 talents, were entrepreneurs. And he had an entrepreneurial 1,000 talent. And I remember when he walked into the room, it was like he gave off an aura, right?
Celebrity.
People would go, oh, wow. And people would put it on their business cards. And that I'm 1,000 talents, right? Or the Changjiang, the Changjiang scholars and other programs. And these are things that if you do your business in China, it brings you real prestige, right? It gives you access to the government that you wouldn't get access on other, without that kind of thing. So there's that advantage.
Yeah, it creates some kind of like risk management for people to work with you.
Oh, that's
because you have access, because you have a designation.
Right. And once the United Front Work Department gets involved in the 1,000 talents and the party gets involved, there's a sense that you've got the party on your side. And as you say, someone will work with you because people do business with the party companies. Right. Right? That's the way China works. Right. And so there's
You at least don't want to do business with someone who is out of favor.
Correct.
Right.
So this shows that these people are in favor, and they're in favor with the organization department or the provincial organization department. And there are these awards at all levels of the system. All the provinces give out awards, similar incentives, money, grants, research opportunities, all of that. So it's at different tiers. These people, they're looking for, I would say one other thing that's important, though, is that there are people who just cheat the system.
Sure.
Right? So part of the people, there are examples of people who will steal some technology. And the DOJ caught some of those people. We know those cases. They've been written up in different scholarly studies about China's theft of technology. And so those people can bring the technology back, maybe set up their own company, maybe become a vice president of a university. I think that part of the theft of cancer research material will give you a good position in a hospital. Sure. Right? If you come back and you can share that kind of information with the hospital, maybe you'll get a better job. And China may just pay people. Right. Right? Just straight out. You bring it back, we'll pay you money. Right. So there is that. And then, of course, there's also a certain percentage, I believe, of the students who come here to study, but study for a short term and then go back, who are related to the PLA. Right. Right. So that's part of the problem too, is that there are some programs that China has set up where universities here in the United States work with universities in China. There's a program called 111. They work with universities in China, and some of those universities are PLA connected universities. And so for some people in the United States will highlight that and say, look, this is a technology transfer of major, strategic importance. But there's only a few schools that are clearly PLA schools. They're what are they called, the Seven Brothers, and those schools are involved. And the United States has said that those people cannot be involved in exchange programs, which is just fine. Which would get us to the idea of what do you do? Right. How do you deal with this?
Yeah, how did the U.S. government, Let me ask you two questions actually on what you do with this. First of all, do you think that the China initiative how do you think it was effective? Did it actually meet it? We clearly did not meet its goal of rooting out tech transfer, because we've said that there's very little tech transfer that was discovered under this plan. Did it have other effects that are measurable and noticeable and significant for the US and China? And then the second is, what do you do when you're confronted with a system like China's that's so opaque, right? Where you really don't know, is a student applying...
And so well organized.
In many ways.
When China wants to do something like we want to get tech,
sure,
they throw the system at it. We've got the United Front Work Department, we've got the organization department.
Right.
They throw the system at it.
That's true. Whether or not it remains effective is still, I think, a question, an open question. But what do you do about a system like that where you really don't have the transparency that you need to make, I would say, rational judgments, and instead you're dealing with this suspicion, could be, maybe not, but we have to kind of treat everybody in the worst case scenario? Or is that a good strategy? Is there something else we should be doing?
Right. So
let's start with was it effective, and then we'll move to what would be effective. Okay.
Now, ironically, I sort of say ironically because I'm very sympathetic to Chinese scholars, and as I told you before, and not in this interview, that I was an expert witness in 2 cases of Chinese who were fired by their universities
under the China initiative.
Under the China initiative. Mm-hmm. So I can talk a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. But so I'm sympathetic to what happened to many of these people, mm-hmm. and the racism or the otherism that happened to them. So I am sensitive to that. But I guess I have to say, ironically, the problem is, for me, now I don't know if it's a problem. The China initiative worked. And
it worked to do?
It worked to, I think, basically stop collaborative research, undermine collaborative research. And if that was the FBI's, the DOJ's, the Trump administration's plan to stop the tech transfer, if it meant stopping everything, that's fine, mm-hmm. right? Just total separation.
A decoupling.
A decoupling in science and technology, that's okay. Mm-hmm. And I could make the argument that to a certain extent that has been successful. Mm. But the reason it's been successful is Section 702.
Tell us more.
Okay, now Section 702 is a section under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, which allows the NSA, the National Security Administration, or agency, to collect 1.8 billion emails a month. Right? So that's 50 million emails a day of email transfers going around the world.
Around the world, not just U.S. citizens.
Not just. But what happens is if you're living in Venezuela and you want to send a message to Germany, mm-hmm. it's likely to pass through AT&T. And therefore
a U.S. carrier or server.
A U.S. carrier. And AT&T mm-hmm. has agreed with NSA that they will turn over all those emails.
I see.
So NSA can scrub those emails. Mm-hmm. And when they scrub those emails and they see something that is a Chinese scholar on the mainland side connecting with a Chinese scholar, ethnic Chinese scholar in the United States, they can flag that and mm-hmm. they can look at those emails. And if they find that there's something that says to them that maybe this is fishy, mm-hmm. maybe there's some kind of national security component, economic or military security, they can then investigate those people, the Chinese in the United States, mm-hmm. even if they're a citizen, they can investigate them without going to get a court order or a court writ.
Is this, just as an aside, is this not very parallel or similar to concerns that the U.S. had about Huawei setting up 5G networks in the United States? The concern was a Chinese carrier will have to turn information over to the Chinese government if necessary. Did they learn from ourselves?
I'm sure they did it before that. Yeah. I think that, they've probably been doing it. I don't know how long the Section 702 has been going on, but it was mm-hmm. just renewed. I see. Which was a huge debate in the United States. And ethnic Chinese groups, 50 groups, Asian groups, were all opposed to it. They were fighting against it, and the FBI director went to Congress and said, we have to have it for national security, and they weren't willing to adjust it.
I see.
Which is what the Asian community really wanted, was some adjustment to it.
Right.
Now, where that becomes really important in 702, and why I say that that's part of the success, is that if you're an ethnic Chinese here in the United States, a Chinese professor, and you're going to collaborate with a guy on the other side, you know that there's a risk that if there's anything at all technologically sophisticated about that, you may get investigated. You may get your phone tapped. You may get, the first guy who got busted from this whole process, a guy named Xu Xiaoxing from Temple University. The FBI broke into his home with guns drawn. This is in 2015. Broke into his home with guns drawn. His kids were at home, and the quote that comes out of that is, he says to his family, do what they say or they'll shoot me.
Oh my.
Right? And the anti-defamation, well, all the human, he won the Sakharov Prize. And so 4 months later, they dropped all charges.
Right. So
they misread the tech.
I see. They misread the tech that was being discussed in an email that they investigated under Section 702.
Correct.
But it had this chilling effect of forcing Chinese researchers in the United States to become self-censored in how they talked to their counterparts overseas.
I think Xi Xiaoxing didn't get them as nervous as once the China Initiative begins.
I see.
Right? Because that was 2015.
Right.
But once the China Initiative begins, and then people find out more, that there's more investigations, and people are being stopped at the airport. Chen Gang from MIT, a very famous, one of the most famous of all the Chinese professors in the United States, gets stopped at the airport in Boston, and they go for 3 hours, and they go through all his computer and all of this, and then they charge him, and eventually all the charges are dropped. So they may have picked him up as well, some kind of transfer through 702. Anyway, so it becomes risky if you're a professor to work with people on the other side, because you could get investigated, and then your life could really be disrupted.
Right.
So I think that's part of, I'm not sure if someone sat there in DC, in the Department of Justice and said, look, here's a great strategy to really, end this.
Right.
But it, to a large extent, it has succeeded. When you put the Chinese scholars in the West in a position where they feel that collaborating with people on the other side can put them at risk, then the collaborations dry up. And the Chinese on the other side may say, look, I'm not collaborating with my friends back in MIT or my friends in America, because I know as soon as I send them an email, could get investigated, get them in trouble.
They could put them at risk.
Correct.
Right.
So
certainly a concern that I think a lot of American scholars have about doing research in China as well. So we're now mirroring each other's suspicions and concerns under this atmosphere of strategic mistrust.
So there have been a series of interviews, studies, surveys done that showed basically a lot of ethnic Chinese or China-born scholars living in the U.S. have said that we're cutting back on our research with China. We've canceled our research with China. I haven't done anything in 3 years, that kind of thing. So, and I just will toss in that it's the same thing in Canada.
Sure.
Right? I'm Canadian, and I followed this somewhat, and the intelligence agencies in Canada have made it very difficult for Canadian Chinese academics living in Canada, ethnic Chinese, to collaborate with China, and that's drying up too. And surveys have shown that they're also saying, well, we're just not going to do that anymore.
Okay, let's talk about the kind of what we could do better, or what is effective through the lens of the kind of opportunity cost that you are starting to outline. I think one opportunity cost is for researchers. If I work with China, I may not have the opportunity to complete U.S. government grants, and we have a lot of evidence that that is certainly a concern among the ethnic Chinese research community in the U.S., maybe even among the non-ethnic Chinese.
Certain percent. People, the surveys have shown that non-ethnic Chinese people will also say, I'm cutting back on my research. I know of one case that I investigated very seriously. I was given the opportunity to investigate a non-ethnic Chinese guy who went to Beijing to give lectures at Tsinghua University. He knew a guy that he had met on a postdoc at Brandeis, and the guy invites him to Tsinghua, and he has a grant from the Department of Energy.
Okay.
And he goes off to China, or maybe it's Department of Defense. So he has a grant from the Department of Defense, and he goes off to China, and he gives some talks, and he comes back, and he discovers all of a sudden he's locked out of his lab. His computer is being investigated. His research is being investigated. And for a year, they do not tell him why.
Wow.
Right? So his lab dies. He can't get answers from the university. And then in the end, they exonerate him, but they tell him you can no longer apply for U.S. government grants. So it's probably that the Department of Defense decided that there was the chance that he was bringing new information to the Chinese, though he claims all of his lectures were based on published material.
Right.
And it was basic research, not technological research. But his career's done.
Right.
So yes, I mean, that's a warning. Don't go lecture. If you've got money from the U.S. government, don't go lecture at Tsinghua University because you could get investigated when you come back. He was stopped at the airport same way.
Oh my gosh. So that is one opportunity cost. Like it's the opportunity cost on researchers for, not paying attention to this very risk-averse environment.
Right. Students.
And students as well.
The number of students coming to the United States, Chinese students coming to the United States, has declined. Data quite clear on that, while the number of Indians have gone up. So maybe you just, you hire Indians instead of Chinese in your laboratory. That's we may see that transition over time, but that's a big issue. People's lives, as we talked about, being disrupted, very expensive. Franklin Tsao, who just won his case, had to spend $2.5 million to defend himself, and the case was eventually dropped.
Wow.
So, yes.
And there's also maybe the opportunity cost of like what this means for U.S. national interest, right? On the one hand, I think we're trying to balance here. It's perhaps fair and appropriate to say, hey, we have an economic competitive advantage in high technology. We don't want it transferred for free or illegally. We also have, areas where we see China as a military threat or a potential military threat. We don't want our technology perhaps to feed into a Chinese military advantage. But those are only two kind of concerns out of a larger bucket of concerns that the U.S. has about what the value of science and technology research means for the world. So you and I were talking about cancer research before. Let's talk a little bit, like what has the cutoff in collaboration meant for areas where there might be beneficial collaborative research for society?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, there was just a recent article in The Economist that had a quote at the bottom of the article about China and tech, and it had quoted a cancer specialist who said China is the best place to do cancer research because there's such a large population that you can test drugs much faster and get much quicker results than you can anywhere else in the world.
Sure.
So people are upset in the cancer world that this cancer research is being slowed down, if not cut off, and that's a problem. And I as I mentioned to you before, I know of this case of an oncologist at NYU who was in the 1,000 Talents plan, but he wasn't such a bad guy. He didn't do, he wasn't transparent enough.
Right.
Could have been more transparent, but he wasn't totally secretive about his links to universities in China and getting assistance, and he was fired.
Right.
And this guy, I've been told, had received $150 million in NIH research over the years since he had been working at NYU. Now there's a guy whose main player gone.
Right.
And there
who
are
could
more
have
people
contributed
like
a lot to the field with that type of resource and support, but was not able to because of the suspicion about his China ties.
Right, and as we were talking before this, you you said that, 40% of all the cancer deaths in the world occur in the United States and China.
Well, don't quote me on that, but on our website, cureforcancer.com, we can tell you all of those statistics with frightening accuracy.
Right. Well, I know that about 25% of the cancer deaths in the world are Chinese. So China has a real serious interest in this.
Right.
And, for the sake of humanity, that's something to understand and to consider. And in terms of both countries being able to solve a terrible disease,
sure,
that's something that could work on agriculture.
Yeah, could be prioritized. Right, agriculture, feeding the world, another area where I think the U.S. and China have considerable interest, mutual interest. But I know that agricultural collaboration has also been frozen by the suspicions that the U.S. has about technology transfer.
Now, yeah, right. But I think it's really important, and one of the reasons that sort of as I wrote the book, I got more and more critical of China is that China is responsible for a significant amount of this. We talked about Xi Jinping. We talked about the opaqueness. China just, on let's say something like agriculture, the two sides should sit down.
Right.
I'm a firm believer that the two sides need to go back to track 2 on this stuff and sit down together and have serious discussion about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. The United States has every right to defend its national interest, its national security. And if there are things that China is doing, they have the right to say no. The Department of Energy had 5 people in the Department of Energy who were members of the 1,000 Talents Plan. Right? A plan run by the organization department of the Communist Party.
Right.
When I hear that, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Right? Those people should not be allowed to join, either quit,
right,
not work with China if you're in that department, or leave.
Right.
That's okay. I don't have a problem with that. But as we've been talking, you got to be more measured in this.
Sure.
And one way of doing that is the conversation between the two sides. Now, there was a study done, the Augustine Commission, which talked about small fields, high walls.
Sure, the small yard, high fence, right?
And that's the buzzword.
Yeah, this is the major challenge as technology becomes embedded into all facets of our life and society. How do you decide what is critical or sensitive? And especially, I think, as technology moves so fast that it's not always apparent at the outset of the technology what is critical or sensitive. So one suggestion you have is dialogue between the two sides to kind of flesh out those issues.
Right, but the Chinese have to be willing to dialogue.
Yeah, how did the Chinese react to the China initiative? Was this an opportunity for self-reflection? How did they kind of, you're laughing, so I'm guessing not.
Right.
Tell me how they reacted.
Well, I mean, I can share with you a magazine in Chinese that I found, an article where there are professors in there who say, boy, our colleagues were really stupid to do this and to be secretive because that's just not the way international science should work. Right? So there was some awareness. And they're putting us at risk in trying to do collaboration with the United States. So that they're putting us at risk.
Right.
So there is that thought. But the immediate response of China was to go dark. Right?
How dark?
Very dark. Just don't talk about the program.
Don't talk about the program. Oh, so in this case, not going dark in terms of criticizing the U.S. response, but to just really...
criticizing the U.S. response too. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Lots of magazines, foreign ministry people, calling it racism and attacking it.
The kind of wolf warrior aspect of China's diplomatic efforts.
They threw them, I've got quotes they threw themselves at that.
Sure.
Right? But dark in the sense of notification went out from the cybersecurity agency to Chinese, I guess, people who ran websites or organizations and said, don't talk about this anymore.
Okay.
Right? You can't, don't mention it.
Interestingly, Made in 2025, Made in China 2025 has also completely disappeared from the canon. But that type of going dark, that type of secrecy does more to engender more strategic mistrust than it does to attack, resolve, somehow mitigate the problems.
Right. I went back to China in December of last year and tried to talk about these issues. And I was able to give a seminar at a university, but it was closed, a closed seminar.
Okay.
Some colleagues helped me give it, set it up, and it was really interesting. The audience was, maybe about 20 people. And one of the scholars who attended, I have this table in the book that lists all of the programs that China has and the number of people or the number of projects involved in trying to do this tech transfer or trying to, the talent programs. So even what you think might be, the Ministry of Education has this thing called the Chunhui program, right? Spring, but it's Chunhui, I'm forgetting for the second what it means. But there's this Chunhui program, and under that, there have been several hundred projects that have competed for support, right? And there seem to be top projects, and they're linked up with overseas entrepreneurs who come to events in China. So the list is section 10, program 101 I mentioned, that's on there, 1,000 talents, 100 talents, Changzheng scholars, all of it. So it makes a nice list, and I put that up on as a PPT, and one of the Chinese looked at it and said, in Chinese, now I understand why the Americans got pissed off.
Right. When you see it all together, you see the volume, you see the effort. It feels threatening, perhaps.
When I make that list, yes.
Yes.
It certainly, from the American perspective,
aggressive at least.
Yeah, you see the scale.
Yeah.
And so I think the Chinese didn't realize that. But again, I wasn't allowed to talk about that outside of the seminar very much. Certainly wasn't allowed to present it in any forum. I had wanted to present it in an alternative forum, and I was told, no, you can't do that. You can't talk about the 1,000 Talents Plan anymore. You can't talk about Li Yuanchao anymore.
The former head of the organization department.
Correct, who started the program. You can't talk about him because he was pushed down, retired, and some of his people were potentially involved in some kind of corruption or something.
Right.
So again,
it's just politically not appropriate.
I was told if I raise that, it looks like I'm trying to stir trouble and factionalism in China. So I was told, don't talk about him.
Well, at least someone told you. I mean, the alternative is that you don't know these things, right? As an outsider coming in, and you end up putting your foot in the political minefield.
Right. Well, that's the advantage of having friends.
That's true. Final question for you.
Sure.
What are we missing about the global war for talent and technology here in the United States? Like, what are our blind spots in the U.S. to this that could help us better think through and contextualize these issues?
Right. Well, I think the first thing that Americans don't understand is the brain drain. So the origins of this whole thing starts with Chinese losing talent, sending people overseas who don't come back.
I see.
Right? And who, in fact, help America be stronger. Right? Why can America do a lot of the technological breakthroughs that it's done? Chinese students, Chinese graduates, Chinese professors, people who came here and got a PhD. So America has been the brain winner.
That's right.
Right? It's brain gain.
Yeah, and in fact, we talk about that frequently. The high quality of our education system and its ability to attract talent from all over the world is an overt strategy to do so.
Right, since the end of World War II.
Right.
Right? So the United States has been I'm part of the brain gain, right? I left Canada and wound up living in the United States. So I'm not much of a brain, but nonetheless. So that's the first thing that Americans never think about.
Right.
Is the fact that they've got that advantage. And therefore the other countries see it as a loss.
Right.
Now, I have Chinese friends who say, wait a second, these guys are ethnic Chinese. We trained them. We gave them an undergraduate degree. Now they're living in the United States. Why can't they help us?
Right.
Right? Now, the alternative would be, well, they're helping you in a way as your country is rising that threatens the United States. So they should be careful. The people who are living in the United States, the Chinese, should be careful, more careful, and I think they will be going forward, more careful in what they do in terms of these transfers. But I think that the Americans don't ever think about it in terms of how it looks to the Chinese side.
Yeah.
So I think that's a problem. I think people, non-ethnic Chinese may not pay attention to the cost of what it means to the Chinese people who live here in terms of feeling racially stigmatized, the difficulties of their lives.
Right.
The NIH still has something like 200 cases that it hasn't solved as of 2020, late 2023, 200 cases it hadn't resolved.
Right.
So there's 200 people sitting there going, am I going to lose my job?
Right.
Are they going to get me for something?
Right. Right. The China initiative formally ended in 2022, right? But a lot of these suspicions, the kind of bigger themes, are not specific to that methodology, and they're still ongoing.
Right. So I would say that those are the things. And again, we talked about the cancer kind of thing. What are the Americans not thinking about? Right? The average person, you're also talking about FBI agents in many cases who have gone out, or an agency like the FBI that doesn't understand China very well. Right? Now we have the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations is now doing programs with the FBI, trying to help them understand. And the FBI of itself, and it's something to praise, is going out to the ethnic community, the Asian ethnic community, and trying to talk to them about they made a mistake, they didn't quite handle it correctly, here's our issues. So I think that that's really important, and that's a really positive thing. And I encourage the Canadian intelligence agencies. I wrote a report saying you guys should go out and talk to the Canadian Chinese, right?
Yeah, there's some damage to repair here.
Right. Well, there certainly is on the U.S. side.
Sure.
Right. On both sides. But the U.S., the FBI is being pretty open about this. I was on a panel for the Committee of 100, which is elite, sort of the leading Chinese, ethnic Chinese people living in the United States. And I was on the panel presenting my stuff, and there was an FBI, a person from the FBI Public Affairs talking about maybe we made a mistake. We didn't know very much about China. I'm a small girl, a girl from a small town, right? And all I know about is, I really want to protect American security.
Sure, which is admirable, but
correct.
Probably insufficient in this case.
Correct. So there needs to be a great deal more sensitivity to what these kinds of, this is a country, again, what are we missing? We're missing the fact that this is a country that has a history of anti-China racism.
The U.S., yes.
Yeah.
100%.
100%.
Anti-Asian racism.
In general, and the Trump administration added to that with the China virus, right? And we had a very short period of time, but a serious period of time where ethnic Asians were getting beat up on the streets of New York.
Correct.
Right, and so all of that came together, right, with the China initiative, with this technology transfer, with all of this stuff coming together to create a pretty toxic environment in the United States for someone who is ethnically Asian and particularly ethnically Chinese. So that's something we have to be conscious of.
Absolutely. And I think here at the Asia Society, we're doing quite a bit of work on creating better understanding of the Asian experience in the United States, but also understanding of these dynamics between the U.S. and Asia and how they affect people's day-to-day lives. So Dr. Zweig, thank you so much for coming and unpacking this multifaceted issue with us. Please give us the title of your book and where to buy it. Sure.
It's called The War for Chinese Talent in America. There's a subtitle, The Politics of Technology and Talent in Sino-U.S. Relations. It's available through Columbia University Press. They're the distributor. It's done it's published. It was written with an organization called the Association for Asian Studies, which is the major Asian studies organization in the world, and they have a series called China Shorts. So it's a short book, only 150 pages. I had to do it within 75,000 words. So it's a short book, easier read, no statistics in the text. The statistics are all in the appendix.
I've read the book. I can attest that it is a short read. It is full of rich anecdotal stories, but also a really clear plot line of how this global war for talent and technology is developed between the U.S. and China. We'll put a link in our post for this episode where you can purchase the book. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to share my views on this.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.